Hello, everyone, and welcome to tonight's session of the Berkeley Forum. My name is Aparna Iyer. I'm currently the president of the forum, and we're incredibly excited to welcome you to tonight's event with Sarah Bloom Raskin. Before we begin, a couple quick reminders for our audience. We'd appreciate it if you could fill out the attendance form at tinyurl.com/bloomraskinattendance, and to submit questions for the moderator to read aloud at tinyurl.com/bloomraskinquestions. We'd also like to give a quick thank you to our partner for this event, the Undergraduate Women in Economics at UC Berkeley, for financially partnering with us. So thank you to them for all of their hard work. And before we get started, the Berkeley Forum would like to take the time to acknowledge that our events and UC Berkeley's campus sit on the territory of the Muwekma Ohlone people. And it's important to us to recognize this because these people are still alive and present within the Bay Area today, and because we benefit from the continued occupation of this land. For more Native education resources on campus, we encourage you to look to the Centers for Educational Justice and Community Engagement. And with that, it's my pleasure to welcome up the event manager for the evening to introduce our speaker, Mehul Sachdev.
It is my honor to introduce Sarah Bloom Raskin to speak at the Berkeley Forum today about the role of financial regulators in navigating climate change. Sarah Bloom Raskin was formerly a governor of the Federal Reserve Board and Deputy Treasury Secretary under former President Barack Obama. Raskin is currently a visiting law professor and Rubenstein Fellow at Duke University School of Law. Throughout her career, Raskin has been a staunch advocate for consumers and had a consistent focus on combating economic inequality, regulating the banking system, and monitoring the plumbing of the economy. Prior to her service in federal government, Raskin served as the chief financial regulator of the state of Maryland from 2007 to 2010, where she cracked down on predatory behavior towards Main Street, particularly related to foreclosure fraud that exploded in the wake of the financial crisis. As a Federal Reserve Board governor and second in command at the Department of Treasury, Raskin was known for her progressivism on monetary policy and regulatory policy issues. So without further ado, I'm excited to welcome Sarah Bloom Raskin to the virtual stage.
Well, first up, let me extend my thanks to Aparna and Mehul and really everyone responsible for bringing me to the Berkeley Forum and to everyone responsible for bringing the Berkeley Forum to me. I'm pleased both technologically that we're able to assemble together virtually, and of course pleased substantively that we're having this time to converse on a topic that is of urgency and import. It takes many hearts and minds to bring us together, and I'm really grateful for them all. So the topic at hand, of course, is the climate crisis and how to address it. I take it as a matter of baseline understanding that we all accept the existence of climate change, that the days of spending much time on debating whether it exists or doesn't, whether it's a hoax or real, are days behind us. Now, this isn't to assume that there is a complete and detailed understanding that all the parameters and mechanisms taking place regarding climate are completely understood. We don't know, for example, the predictions for relationships between solar radiations and the atmosphere, nor do we know with precision the timing of the various interactions amongst the oceans, biosphere, cryosphere, pedosphere, and lithospheres. We're also dealing with uncertainty, and some would say radical uncertainty, regarding the contours of climate change, by which I mean all the dimensions of how climate change manifests itself socially, politically, and economically. And yet, even without knowing with precision the dynamics of this multi-dimensional, nonlinear system involving a multiplicity of subsystems, it's recognized with near universal acceptance that climate change is real, that data exists, that proves its existence and its interactions, that we're living through it as we speak, and that it is imposing costs of growing magnitude. Needless to say, in the United States, this recognition among many has come slowly and reluctantly. We are today seeing, though, a much improved alignment between, on the one hand, a new administration filled with people and experts who understand climate change, and on the other hand, large swaths of Americans who came out in record numbers to vote for people who understand climate change and want to focus on doing something about it. This alignment was astoundingly absent during the last administration and the 4 years in it. And the costs associated with those lost 4 years as they pertain to addressing climate change are with us today. But today there is both better alignment and there's momentum. The momentum in the last several months is itself impressive. To look at the massive mobilization around the idea that climate change is real, particularly as embraced by Wall Street and the financial sector, one would think that there has been this collective awakening, a kind of Rip Van Winkle moment where we are all poised to tackle something that many had denied even existed mere months ago. Indeed, there seems to be a new urgency here in the United States, and on face value, it's a splendid, if belated, recognition that there's much work to be done to achieve net zero and the goals of the Paris Climate Accords. But while we watch a new administration recognize and take on the course of climate change, while we say things like, wow, look at the titans of Wall Street embrace climate change and put in place plans to cut their greenhouse gas emissions, we also know that the planet is still warming at an alarming rate. We know that the economic costs associated with environmental destruction, the wildfires, hurricanes, tornadoes, rising sea levels, air quality and water quality reductions, the health effects, the costs continue their climb. We know that climate-related financial risks are growing and becoming magnified, that new ones are emerging that had not been considered a mere 6 months ago. Despite the new urgency, and despite the new actors and sectors that are embracing the new urgency, there's still much to do. The International Energy Agency tells us that as economies begin to rebound from the pandemic restrictions, that carbon emissions will soon surpass pre-pandemic levels. If we were given some kind of respite during the pandemic from the production of already high greenhouse gas emissions, that respite is coming to an end. And we're going to see a resurgence of climate change and its concurrent climate-related financial costs moving fast. This reality brings us firmly then within a stark reality, which is this: unabated, climate change may continue to move faster than the ability of the private sector and the ability of local, state, and federal government entities to deal with it. There's but one antidote to this reality, which is to set the conditions to slow the rate of climate change. There are mountains of work involved here, coming from all corners, a whole of government, whole of household, whole of business, whole of technology, whole of societal effort. I've not been able to see how it can be anything less. And perhaps, fortunately, the times hath found us, as they have in so much, and there appears to be a solid commitment to seize the opportunities embedded in this existential imperative and start the concerted, coordinated work to get ahead of this challenge, all while reaping some of the transformational benefits provided by it. Of course, none of us is expected to do it all or to carry this imperative alone. As it is said, we do what we can. And what I can do, at the very least, is apply my own particular expertise regarding financial markets and the economy to this most extraordinary of risks. As I have begun to apply that expertise, I have come to a singular recognition, and it's this. In order to maximize the speed and safety of a move into a sustainable, durable, net zero economy and away from climate change disaster, we need to use the financial regulatory apparatus to engage financial markets and financial institutions in affecting both direction and pace. So this is a bit of an esoteric kind of wonky topic. The use of financial regulation as a precision instrument that can help support the steering of more direct climate change, aversion, and resilience policies. Indeed, the intersection of climate science and financial regulation is one where not many people have historically resided. We have our scientists in one camp and our financial regulatory experts in another camp, and rarely have these camps had much use for discourse with each other. Up until now, the intersection didn't even really exist, but now it does, and it is rich with potential. So that's what and where we'll explore today. So for my remaining remarks, and before we open this up to questions and discussion, I want to proceed as follows. So this is our roadmap. First, I want to start with the rationale for considering financial regulation in the realm of abating the pace of climate change and speeding the transformation to a more sustainable economy. Second, I want to explain some of the financial regulatory agencies that might have tools that are relevant to this imperative, that imperative again being to abate the pace of climate change and speed the transformation to a more sustainable and durable economy. And third, I want to suggest how these financial regulatory interventions must be considered carefully and in a coordinated way if they are to meet the challenge of their proposed rationale. So first, the rationale. Let's explore the rationale for financial regulation. When people think of how to set back the course of climate change, they think about a lot of approaches. One approach is how to drain the earth of the toxic effects of greenhouse gas emissions. This may involve enhancing biodiversity, or it may involve encouraging the use of new technologies that can, say, capture CO2 emissions and redeploy those emissions from something that is destroying us to something that could help us. While many people address their efforts to draining what is already there and addressing the damage that has already been created, for example, in many communities, and stopping the proliferation of the toxic events, others are addressing their efforts to stopping new emissions, the source of new damage. So there's a tension on both what has already happened in terms of climate change damage and what is continuing to fuel the development of new climate change damage. Policymakers at all levels, local, state, regional, federal, and international, are variously approaching these challenges simultaneously. As you know, these policymakers have various levels of expertise. They are biologists, environmental scientists, chemists, biochemists, physicists, earth and planetary scientists. They are social scientists like political scientists, economists, and psychologists. They are public health experts and medical experts. They are community organizers and climate activists. There are hosts of expertise that are being brought to these efforts. These efforts are vast and integral and cover broad spans of the climate change situation. And then there's the slice of expertise that we're talking about now, which is the expertise having to do with financial regulation. Financial regulation, as it is practiced and institutionally structured, has several purposes, ranging from missions such as mitigating risks to financial stability, assuring consumer protection, assuring investor protection, providing market information that market prices may not, and assuring the safety and soundness of banks. The costs associated with climate change all touch these missions and purposes. But when you think about climate change, you may think that financial institutions and their financial regulators are not at the heart of the challenge. After all, the financial firms themselves are not in the business, usually, of being the direct emitters and polluters themselves. Although questions of carbon footprints of financial firms, like any firms, need to be addressed internally and usually by the managers of all firms. But when it comes to financial firms in particular, their unique role as intermediaries and allocators of credit and investment capital, one can imagine that their actions will have effects on the pace of climate change. If they are financing high carbon emitters, or if they're financing new technologies and alternative forms of energy providers that are low carbon emitters, or are drawers down of the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. Ultimately, these financial intermediary activities will be relevant to the pace of climate change. It turns out that the financial firms themselves are not just potential contributors to the pace of climate change, but they themselves are also the potential victims of climate change. They can be both on the receiving end of costs that they didn't create themselves, as well as on the contributory side. It's no surprise, for example, that insurance companies were tip of the spear when it came to identifying how the growth of climate-related financial costs could contribute to their future ability to insure properties against all sorts of loss related to climate-related events. Banks, too, now understand that the threat of delinquencies and defaults increases when the collateral they hold against loans becomes destroyed or devalued by climate-related events. In other words, some firms themselves are contributing to climate change by financing high emission activities, and they themselves are subjecting themselves to the losses from it. This is the classic rationale for financial regulation, the deployment of some set of tools or instruments that can assist in the navigation through these sets of harms. That said, in my opinion, maybe the most important justification for the right forms of financial regulation is the need both to amplify and to focus the more direct policy measures that are being taken with the emitters themselves. What we need is a set of instruments that will amplify and focus the benefits and enormous gains that we are making as we transition to a net zero economy. We're moving from an economy that is powered heavily by fossil fuels into a future economy that will be driven primarily by clean sources. This glide path is necessary if we are to avoid the climate catastrophe that comes from fossil fuels and their collateral consequences like destruction and extinction. And while all the governments of all the world's economies determine how they move away from this treacherous path to a path characterized by the upside of durability, sustainability, good jobs, good health, exciting and transformative investments and technologies, the role of financial regulators becomes integral. I'm no sailor, but I read an account of some sailors that bring to mind the challenge that I'm talking about. And it seems to me that it has everything to do with navigating through these two powerful currents that exist off the coast of British Columbia. So off that coast are these two straits. One strait is called the Strait of Georgia, and another strait is called the Queen Charlotte Strait. And between these straits is a passage where the two straits clash. This passageway, I'm told, I've read about, is unstable, to say the least, as any wrong move will throw your boat into one or the other powerful and exceedingly dangerous current. So when maneuvering through this passage between the two straits, you need a rudder of the most sensitive kind and someone who can maneuver that rudder in such a way that a glide path is created for safe passage. So, maneuvering through the climate crisis is not unlike this supreme maritime challenge. One set of currents is the historically established and foundational carbon-based economy. The other set of currents is the well-realized future resilient economy that we need to glide towards. Right now, we are in between these currents, attempting to maneuver away from the destructive forces that the carbon-based economy are creating, while heading towards the regenerative and beneficial systems associated with a more durable future state of an economy. This is the treacherous passage we are navigating, trying to neither stay too long in the carbon-based systems, nor to veer too quickly towards resilient systems that have yet to be scaled to provide for the world's demand. We need skill to do this. We need dexterity. And this skill and dexterity are what smartly crafted financial regulation does. They are the rudders that get us through this transition. We need them the way we need a rudder to help us transition to a net zero economy in the most stable, least dangerous way possible. That's the metaphor I'm working with to describe this acute need for getting the rudders set appropriately so that the sailors can carry us safely through the passage to the beneficial economy that we're building. So, what are these rudders when it comes to financial regulation? Where do they reside? Well, we have in the alphabet soup of financial regulators a host of agencies. There's the SEC, that's the Securities and Exchange Commission. The Fed, that's the Federal Reserve. The CFTC, that's the Commodities Futures Trading Commission. The Comptroller of the Currency, the Federal Housing Finance Agency, and I dare say many, many others. These US financial regulators and the others have substantial power to help mitigate the climate crisis because each has a set of rudders, so to speak, some of which could be relevant to mitigation of the financial risks that are emerging from climate change. So you've likely heard about some of them, and they range in their effectiveness and in their precision and in the context for their best use. Some of them take the form of mere statements or guidances from financial regulators, suggesting that financial firms under their jurisdiction monitor and manage climate-related risk themselves. Some of these rudders take the form of disclosure requirements questions. And you likely have heard about the need for better climate-related disclosures to enable the market to price the relevant risks more accurately. You could be hearing about collecting more data and conducting better analysis of climate-related risk, particularly quantitative and qualitative analysis. There are discussions underway about climate stress tests as another potential rudder. And the most hawkish voices on climate are urging financial regulators to increase the amount of capital that banks must hold to offset fossil fuel assets, thereby reducing the incentive to finance fossil fuels and counterbalancing the risk of holding assets that could lose value rapidly in the not too distant future. So these are some of the so-called rudders that are being discussed as potential navigational tools that the US financial regulators could deploy to enhance the speed and effectiveness of getting us to realize the benefits and gains that come from transitioning to a net zero economy against climate-related financial risks. Now, each of these rudders has to be evaluated for its effectiveness. Consider, for example, the last rudder that I just mentioned, the use of imposing higher levels of capital requirements against fossil fuel assets. What would this rudder do as it pertains to climate change? How would it enhance the benefits and enormous gains that could be realized in transitioning to a net zero economy? Well, risk-based capital requirements enable financial institutions to continue engaging in activities similar to their current ones, only presumably more safely. They're meant to reduce the potential for debilitating delinquencies and defaults later on. So while they have these particular beneficial effects, they're really not designed to guide the financial system through cataclysmic changes like the rapid and dramatic economic transition to clean energy that is already underway and must be hastened to respond adequately to the climate crisis. Nor are they a match for the accelerating cascade of crises spurred by climate chaos from under-mitigated greenhouse gas emissions. You see, climate change puts the financial system on a difficult path. Looming climate catastrophe and the economic transformation required to fend it off, such that great harm from one or the other is nearly certain, at least in the absence of careful management by financial regulators. Part of the job of the financial regulators is to steer the financial system through these two extremes, irreversible climate catastrophe on the one hand, and the transition to more durable investment portfolios and systems and communities on the other hand. Again, to be clear, this is not to say that financial regulators are expected to mitigate the climate crisis by themselves. Not at all. But they should do their part to curb financial institutions' contributions to it, and stopping self-destructive behavior by financial institutions is at the core of the regulator's supervision and prudential regulation missions. We can debate what the right rudders may be and how and when they become deployed. Financial regulators need to be looking at the most prudent rudders, so to speak, that they have. My own opinion in this debate is that institutions like the SEC, the Fed, the Treasury, the CFTC, and others should be describing for Americans what kind of rudders they have. Americans need to understand that these rudders are what will be helping steer markets and firms away from catastrophe and towards benefit. And as important as having the right rudders may be, it's also important that they be deployed in a timely way. The maneuvering we must do now gives us no room for timidity when it comes to imagination, development, and effective deployment. So let me close this way. Broadly speaking, unabated climate change is producing an economy and society that is dangerous to our well-being. We have begun to move towards an economy and society that's better for us, that produces durable benefits in terms of human health, economic well-being, and inclusive prosperity for all our communities, households, businesses, and innovators. To capture these benefits requires a maneuvering that is not easy, but that is within the power to imagine. We need rudders, and we have them, to help us maneuver through this treacherous passage. If we stay clear-eyed and candid about what they can and can't do, we will assist in this passage. And when we do that, when we stay clear-eyed, we will reap the benefits of an economy that is durable, sustainable, inclusive, beneficial, and prosperous in the fullest sense. This is where we have to go, and we need to bring all we have to bear to make it happen. So, thank you for your time and attention, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much for that address. It was great to hear. It is now my pleasure to invite up our student moderator for the evening from the Berkeley Forum, Noah Oppenheimer.
Great. Thank you, Aparna, and thank you, Sarah, for that address. We're really excited to have you today, and that definitely lived up to, I'd say, all of our expectations. I'm sure everyone in the audience would agree. Just a quick reminder to anyone who's watching this event online, there is the audience question answer form that you can go ahead and fill out. It should be pinned in the Facebook chat. And when you submit that, we'll be bringing up a portion of those questions at the end of this event. But first, just going to start with some questions that we at the Berkeley Forum prepared for you today. So first of all, I think you discussed kind of the long-term shift of how you see, financial regulators not only focusing on, or focusing more on climate issues, but you say in the past that was something that was kind of siloed, right? Financial regulators did not really focus on climate issues as much. I'd be interested to know, coming from a background of working in financial regulation, obviously you held roles at the Fed, you held roles at the Treasury. How did your career kind of shift to drawing more attention to these issues on a more personal level?
Oh, it's a great question, Noah, and you're exactly right. I think you've diagnosed it exactly right. There has been a change in how financial regulation can be an important tool to mitigating climate change and climate risk. And it's a very new idea. It's a new idea, I should say, in the US, although I should say in other countries, the Europeans in particular, and the Chinese and some of the Asian countries really did get quite advanced in their thinking about how financial regulation could be used in the climate change context. And that's, I think, for a variety of reasons. We were in the mode of climate denial in our country for at least the last 4 years. And that was valuable time that we could have used to be thinking more proactively about how to be dealing with this particular risk. But in your question about the more sort of my own kind of voyage through to this topic, in my experience, I have lived through a financial crisis, and we've now all lived collectively through this pandemic. And you can see essentially how these kind of invisible enemies can really upend a society. These risks that essentially are sometimes hard to see as physical things can create a lot of havoc and real pain. in our economies and in our society. And in my experience, as was brought out, so beautifully in the introduction, I saw, what a crisis can do to people's sense of livelihood. They can lose homes, they can lose jobs, they can lose a sense of wealth, building, and a sense of prosperity. We've seen like the student loan debt crisis, and what financial insecurity looks like and financial anxiety looks like to people. So this idea of being able to see around corners and try to prevent big catastrophes from occurring, I think is very important. And the financial regulators in the US tend to be a little slow. I mean, they tend to pick up these signals in a kind of belated way. And I'd like to see some lessons learned here. Climate change is one that we actually can't deal with too late. We have to deal with it in a proactive, early stage way. And that's going to take a mind shift, but we have lived through these crises with kind of invisible enemies that seep into our systems and cause such great turmoil, that I'd like to see how financial regulators can bring their tools to bear in helping thwart or mitigate some of this pain and anxiety and disaster that has come our way.
So you mentioned a big part of that was, living and working through a financial crisis, and I would assume you're assuming to 2008. Obviously, just to maybe talk a little bit more about your background, when you started at the Federal Reserve on the Board of Governors, I believe that was in 2010, so just after that crisis. How, if at all, did the aftermath of that crisis affect the work that you did during your time at the Fed?
Well, it's another good question. And when I joined the Fed in 2010, from my perspective, the crisis wasn't over. There were still, unemployment was still very high. A lot of people had lost jobs. Student loan debt was very high. A lot of delinquencies and defaults on student loans. People had lost their homes, their sense of livelihood. We had seen the effects of inequality emerge in a very stark way in our recovery there. So in other words, the financial sector, I think, rebounded quickly, but a lot of communities and households responded and recovered much more slowly. So we had a kind of divergence in the recoveries that we saw. And so by the time I joined in 2010, from my perspective, it was almost just beginning. I mean, the hard days of the actual financial crash might have been over, but the lasting effects of what had happened were front and center from my perspective. And a lot of work needed to be done in 2010 when I joined the Federal Reserve. So the experience of seeing the results of what a financial crisis can do, and how inequitable the effects of a crisis can hit different communities and our society as a whole, remained very troubling for me, and something that I think needs to continue to be looked at carefully and not kind of pushed under the rug. So, climate is really, really no different in terms of how these costs are affecting different sectors of our economy. I mean, there are communities that would just, if you saw what climate change was doing to those communities, it would just take your breath away. It is it's so completely inequitable where the costs and how the costs are getting borne. That said, I maintain that the costs of climate change are going to be felt by all of us. And it is really like an equal opportunity crisis, if you want to put it in those terms. So the lessons really of how we responded to earlier crises, I think need to inform how we're going to respond to this one.
And now you mentioned, the impact of climate change on very specific communities and how it can obviously target certain communities, potentially certain regions more than others. Now, something that some people have argued is that there's a large necessity for collaboration or potentially just action on behalf of local governments, state governments, when it comes to the climate crisis. I know that you also do have a bit of a background in state regulation and state financial policy. And so my question to you would be, what areas, if any, exist for collaboration between these large federal agencies you mentioned, like maybe the SEC, the Department of Treasury, so on and so forth, and local and state governments as well?
It's a necessity that there be this collaboration. So in my experience, a lot of the very innovative work on addressing climate change has been coming from the state and local and regional level, particularly in the last 4 years, where virtually nothing was done on climate at the federal level. So you really saw regional efforts form to create and consider certain solutions to different climate related challenges. And I think that those efforts have turned out to be really important pilot projects, almost laboratories, experiments to some extent, that we should be tapping into to see kind of what works and what doesn't work. Because there's been a lot of work done on climate at the state level, at the local level, at the regional level. And those efforts, I think, are really fertile, provide really fertile information for us to evaluate, to see whether and the extent to which they should be taken at a bigger level, to move them into having an impact on greater and greater numbers of people and regions. So I think that the collaboration piece is really, really important here. And I think that state and local and regional efforts and results and leaders can help show us the way.
And so to maybe follow up on that a bit, as you said, we have seen a lot of very divergent proposals at the state and local level. There's California, for instance, has a cap and trade system, and there obviously are other proposals out there. In terms of the kind of multitude of potential solutions that we've seen proposed going forward, what, if any, have you seen or do you believe to be the most effective options?
So I probably would not venture to prioritize, okay? But the prioritization, I think, is an important one. I would like to see a cataloging of really all of the efforts and an evaluation of all of those efforts on particular, with particular criteria. And then I would say, and this is a big effort because, as you say, California has been an extraordinary laboratory, way ahead of some other parts of the country on trying different things regarding to the mitigation of climate change, the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, the development of buffers and resilient systems that would, in essence, help cushion the blow of future climate change events. And of course, California has also been the heart of a lot of where our climate-related disasters, natural disasters, have been occurring. So there's a lot to learn from California, but there's a lot to learn from other regions as well. We just had, we've just seen Texas, reach 0 degrees, right? Freezing levels where people lost heat for days on end. Okay, this is not supposed to happen in Texas, right? I don't think anybody moves to Texas thinking that they're ever going to be living in 0 degree, consistent, like 0 degree freezing temperatures. So we have in Texas some very interesting lessons to learn about how, first of all, why these climate changes happened there, but secondly, how the state actually responded. How did the infrastructure there weather the storms, so to speak, and be able to move people to a place of, of not having to huddle in their cars for days on end. So there are lessons here across the country, and I think we need to look at them and evaluate them in a systematic way, and then start scaling them up. Like, choose a couple of them for experimentation on a bigger level, fund them to do more, and start to run these experiments, so to speak, in a broader way, so that we can start bringing all the tools to bear on this.
Great. Well, thanks a lot for those answers. And now I think, as we have maybe around 5 minutes left, we just move into some questions that we did receive from the audience. And I'll make sure to kind of give a shout out to the person who asked this question. So the first one comes from Samuel, and he says that in your statement, you mentioned that we're past the point of talking about whether or not climate change is real. But he points out that there are many lawmakers who don't believe in climate change. And even during the pandemic, he says that we've seen lawmakers kind of show that they don't always believe in the most up-to-date science. So how can we continue to advance agendas regarding climate change if the people in government, or at least a large portion of them, don't even believe in it to begin with?
Great question, Samuel. And I knew when I said that I was predicting I would get this question, because yes, there still remain climate deniers. And I didn't mean to suggest that all climate denialism had disappeared. And you're right that we need to take climate, we need to take this. I always take the science seriously. If I see science that essentially tells me something else, I would take that seriously. In this case, the science is all pointing in one direction, and that is essentially underscoring the existence of climate change. What does that do about the climate deniers? I continue to think we cannot waste time essentially debating issues that I think science has overwhelmingly established. So my own approach is to think of ways in which you bring the climate deniers along in your efforts, and maybe there's a way to achieve some kind of common ground. I think, for example, the Biden administration's recent infrastructure climate proposal tries to think about climate in the context of infrastructure. And I think that's a useful, that may be a useful way to kind of bypass these arguments that can be real rabbit holes. Real diversions can really be like time sucks if you essentially let them. So, we can't waste time. We know that we are very, very close to this 2-degree tipping point, and it seems to me that we have to move forward. We're going to have to do something to help mitigate these costs. And while I still want to watch the science and believe in science and want to see something that could contradict, what we are seeing, I would love to see that. It has to be credible, and so far there hasn't been anything credible on the climate denial side. So it's a great question, Samuel. And it's one, that we have to keep our eyes on, but I don't want to be diverted by it. And I don't think any of us should.
And then the next question comes from Peter. I think it's one that's probably very relevant to a lot of the people who are watching today, or at least I would venture to guess. And he says, what advice would you give students who are interested in transforming the financial sector into a greener one? Where may we have the largest impact, as consumers or working from the inside?
Oh, I love that question. And I didn't catch what's the questioner's name, Noah?
Peter.
Peter. So Peter, thank you. Thank you for that, because I hear in that question a kind of excitement about what is to come, and what the potential here is of a cleaner, more inclusive, more durable, sustainable economy, and people wanting to be part of that. So, very practically speaking, I would look for opportunities that allow you to join your expertise into that kind of mission. And as I mentioned in my talk, there are all levels of expertise that come to bear. And I talked about the different scientists, different social scientists, different advocates, public health experts. There is so much that is needed to engage in this transformation. And I don't know, Peter, what your particular, what your major is, or what your particular, what your particular skill set is, but I guarantee that there is a way to connect it into this, this mission and this very important work. And what you need to decide is the extent to which, you do want to do it as a policymaker, or whether you want to do it in another way, on the outside, as you drew this distinction between being on the inside, being on the outside. There are virtues to both. And it's not as if one group, either on the inside or the outside, has the sort of the better track to effectuate this transformation, because it's going to come from all different places. One of the most exciting things about the transformation, I think, is the development of new jobs that are really, really kind of interesting. I mean, things that we hadn't even thought about before, or maybe not in a big way, but jobs, such as, installing solar panels or batteries. I mean, there are just a whole host of kinds of exciting things that come, I think, with clean energy, architecture, urban planning. I think there's just a host of different potentials that are going to be, and that we're starting to see are being unleashed in this creation. So, virtues, I think, on both sides, in terms of inside, outside government. And of course, government is a big thing, right? Government can be at any level. And you can also have, nonprofits, NGOs that also play important roles. So good luck.
Well, thanks a lot for that. That is unfortunately all the time that we have for questions today. So that I'll pass it back to Aparna, our president, just to conclude, if you wouldn't mind staying on the line.
Thank you both so much. A huge virtual round of applause to our speaker and to Noah, our moderator for the evening. Sarah, we really appreciate you being here. And as a token of our appreciation, at every Berkeley Forum event, our communications team designs a custom poster created for you, just as a thanks for being here tonight, and for being a part of our lineup. We're super excited to have hosted this event. And actually, at this point, if you have any last closing remarks that you'd like to make as we close out, you can feel free.
Oh, well, first of all, thank you for inviting me again. And it's been a pleasure to be able to talk to you and to hear such good questions. Thank you, Noah, for such fine moderation. And this is really kind of cool, this thing you just created. I really am taken by it, and I'm going to read it carefully.
Yeah, no, we're so glad you like it. This was designed by Dixie from our communications team, so I'll make sure to let her know you like it. And when we're safe and back in person, we'll make sure to send it out to you. But thanks so much.
Thank you.
All right. Yeah, and then just to close out the event, I'd just like to give a quick recognition to the people who worked on this event behind the scenes. So thank you to Mehul, our event manager, to Brian, to Sarah, to Dixie, and to Noah for making this all happen. And to our audience, we do have more Berkeley Forum events coming up this semester. On the 8th, we will be hosting Dr. Ruth Simmons, the first African-American Ivy League president. So make sure to tune into that one. And thank you so much for coming tonight. We encourage you to fill out the feedback form at tinyurl.com/forumfeedbackspring21. And if you'd like to keep up with what we're doing, you can like us on Facebook or visit our website at forum.berkeley.edu. And lastly, if you're willing and able in any way, we'd love it if you could help support us. Our Venmo is linked below, and any amount goes toward helping us put on more events. So to everyone who came out tonight, thank you so much for spending your evening at the Berkeley Forum, and we'd love to see you at another event soon. Thank you.